time we say goodbye, my dear. I don't know why it's so unclear. Your mouth says go away, but your body's telling me to stay. I don't know just what to do.
Hello everybody, and welcome to There and Then. I'm your host, Don Gutteridge. This is a podcast where we take a look at the works of one Canadian author, my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, and find out what inspires him, what inspired him to write, and where his work fits in the broader picture of Can Lit. Now, Don's the author of over 50 books, and being as this is our first episode, it's probably good for me to give you a little bit of a biographical note. So, Grandpa was born in 1938. He went to school in Point Edward, Ontario, and then he lived in Chatham for a while. Went to university at UWO, and then worked as a high school teacher for a while before settling into his longest and final career as an English professor at Althouse College, which is the teachers' college associated with UWO in London. Grandpa worked there for, I believe, at least 20 years, and during that time he was writing constantly. He's written in multiple forms, including poetry, prose in both fiction and nonfiction, and professional works dealing with teaching English. In this episode, we're going to be discussing two of his novels, and really we're trying to start at the start. Now, chronologically speaking, these aren't the first works we're going to talk about in this series, but being as they're as close to a biographical look at Grandpa as we're going to get, this is a great place to start. The two works we're going to discuss are novels called Summer's Idyll and Winter's Descent, both available as ebooks on Amazon for anyone that is interested. As far as paper copies go, they've been out of print a while, but we're working on it. We'll see what happens. So you'll hear a little more about the details of the book, but just as an overview, they're a fictionalized portrayal of Grandpa's young life in Point Edward, Ontario, and which is a small border town just by Sarnia, for anyone that's not familiar. It's actually where the Blue Water Bridge is located. And especially in the last, 30 years, so the duration of my life, Grandpa has got more and more nostalgic for those times, and more of his writing focuses on that period of his life. Summer's Idyll is born of that seed. Now, to admit my bias, Summer's Idyll is my favorite of Grandpa's works, so it's great that we get to start here. And Winter's Descent is a very good book as well, but as you'll hear, it's a darker story, and it's a bit of a harder read. So if you're going to start anywhere with Grandpa, Summer's Idyll is a great place. The way we see it, the point of this podcast isn't to go over everything with a fine-toothed comb and really tease out every bit of meaning. It's more to enjoy the books and reflect on them a little. I would highly encourage you to pick up Summer's Idyll or Winter's Descent. You can get them on Amazon as an ebook for the time being. And without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Don.
Would you stop me saying no, no, no? I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Alright, hi everybody. Welcome. I'm here with my grandfather, Don Gutteridge, again. Hi, Grandpa.
Good morning, Tom. Or good afternoon, Tom.
How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
So we're meeting again on a lovely afternoon in June. It's warm, but not too warm. And we've finally got some of that beautiful summer weather, which is fitting, because today we're going to be discussing two novels that Grandpa wrote in, the early 90s?
Early 90s, yeah.
Yeah, wrote in the early 90s, called Summer's Idyll and Winter's Descent. I guess you could call them semi-autobiographical.
Yeah, I call them my memoir novels.
And so that captures it accurately. They follow the life and maturation of a young boy named Will in the town of Point Edward, Ontario, which is Grandpa's hometown. I had never actually been to Point Edward, or well, I had, but I was very young. Grandpa and I actually got down again recently, and it was really wonderful, and I think it helped me understand these books a little better. How did you feel after our trip, Grandpa?
Oh, wonderful! I relived the book, so I was really keen to get back and start rereading them again.
Yeah, and so Grandpa's had the opportunity to read through them again this week, and I had a good look over my notes, so there's a lot of really interesting stuff to talk about in these books. I guess we should start at the start. Can you take me back to where Summer's Idyll came from?
Well, Summer's Idyll is actually about a summer in 1947, when I would be Will's age, 10 just going on 11. And I wanted to write, initially, a memoir novel, and I discovered I couldn't write about myself that way. So I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll write a kind of fictional account that uses just about everything I ever experienced in my boyhood. And that's the feeling I got when I reread it. That, oh my word, the experience that I poured into those two books. And so the initial idea, the initial title, was The Day the Stranger Came. It was going to be sort of a bit of a suspense novel with the appearance of this mysterious person. But as it turned out, I decided to make it about the circus we actually put on in 1947, in the summer of 1947. I moved the time period back to 1944, or 45, I can't remember which. But
I think it's 44.
44. There's a date, isn't there, on the first page?
Yep.
It's 44. And I wanted to move it back there because I wanted a war theme, war, violence, anti-war, particularly in the second novel, which is more of a novel to do with the war. But the boys in the books are very aware of the war. They have fathers in the war. They get letters from their fathers, and that makes for lots of good drama.
Yes, absolutely. And it's one of the sort of it's sort of how you signpost the book in a way too, because frequently there are headlines. Periodically you have your main character reading headlines, I should say.
Right.
That bookmark rather definitively when all these events are happening.
Well, it's what he sees walking through his grandparents' kitchen, and Grandma or Grandpa got the paper up in front of them, and he sees these headlines, and that's what sticks in his head, are these big, bold headlines.
Yeah. So basically the action of the novel is the little games kids play seems to be one of the main themes in the novel. So you have them playing things like Capture the Flag. You have them playing all manner of baseball games. What
Prisoner's Base?
Prisoner's Base.
Yeah.
Is that representative of how you guys would spend your time in the old village?
Actually, yes, it is. And I was thinking as I was rereading it today, how life has changed for children being brought up today. No, we went to the movie theater every Saturday for a double feature and a serial and a cartoon, and then we role played. The first thing when we got home in the late afternoon, we would role play the cowboy and Indian show that we had just seen, and we would fight over who was going to be the cowboy and who was going to be the Indian, and whether he was a good Indian or a bad Indian. So all those kinds of details are from my experience, and almost all of the shows and radio shows mentioned are actually real or very close to real.
Yeah. It certainly paints a vivid picture of what it was like to be a child in Point Edward. The one thing I got a distinct sense of how the place might have been in your time. Clearly things have changed a lot in the amount of vehicle traffic.
Right.
But in your time, it was about 5 minutes from one side of the village to the other.
Yeah, that's right.
And by your description, it was full of kids.
And there were kids in every house.
Yeah. And so you guys had a fairly sort of a vivid, ranging style of play that seemed to sort of take you all over town.
Yeah, we had our area of town. It was our territory. That's right, our terrain.
And it was funny because you were talking about the kids from the other neighborhood, which was 2-3 blocks away.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah.
It's fascinating. When did you start to think about these Point Edward memories and think you wanted to make something out of them?
It was in the early 90s when I was not writing a lot of poetry then. I started the late phase of my poetry about the middle of that decade on. And what I was thinking about, as I said previously, I was thinking about a memoir. I was thinking I'm at the time of my life, I've probably written all the novels I'm going to write. I had that feeling at the time. And I sat down to try to write a memoir, and I couldn't do it.
Yep. Well, and I think I remember you telling me once that literary memoirs were very popular at that point in time.
Yes.
Is that true? Did you tell
me
that?
They were. Memoirs were very popular, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I find fascinating about this, and I just hoped I could get you to elaborate on a little, was the process that these books came together, was different than the way maybe you'd written some of your other novels.
Definitely, certainly different from my my detective novels, which are written in a linear fashion, straight out from the beginning to the climax and the end of the novel. These novels were written the way you might write a movie script, scene by little scene. I even wrote some of them in my office at Althouse College at my noon hour. I'd sit down and I'd write another little scene of Summer's Idyll.
Yeah.
And if you flip through the book, you don't see a scene longer than about 3 pages.
Yep. It's definitely a series of little vignettes, and there is an overarching narrative that strings them together, but each of them is their own self-contained little piece of the puzzle.
Well, one of the threads that keeps the narrative flowing is, of course, the preparations for the for the circus.
Yeah.
I just before you came in, I was rereading the one where Wiz is Magnus the magician, and his trick fails.
Gets his sister trapped in the box.
Yeah.
Is that what you're? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a.
And she comes slamming out of the box, cursing him.
That's got to be one of my favorite scenes in the books. Just to give a little bit of background, the scene Grandpa's describing, Wiz is, well, we'll get around to that. Okay,
yeah.
But I wanted to ask about Wiz. Wiz was a real fella?
Oh, definitely. And Wiz was his nickname.
Withers was his last name,
Dave
right?
was his real name, Dave Withers, yeah.
Was he a little bit older than you?
Yeah, he was maybe a year and a half older than me. And I think he was in grade 9 in the tech school in Sarnia, and he was a technical wizard. He could do anything with his hands. That's why we called him Wiz.
Because I think you told me one time that he could make pinball machines. He could make little simple machines to do basic things.
Yeah, he made a derby racer.
Yeah,
it was just wonderful, and we pushed him all around town in it.
Oh, like a cart.
Yeah. Soapbox derby, we called it.
Okay, yes. The Scouts still do that.
Soapbox derby racing, and he got 2 sets of buggy wheels.
Yeah.
From around, there were always buggies sitting around town in people's yards, and he collected a couple of them, and it was a beauty. But all we got to do was push him.
Yeah. Yes. And so Wiz is one of the sort of the central characters in the novel, along with a couple of the other boys. Mm-hmm. And so your main crew was Wiz Withers. You've got Butch.
Yeah, who's Hutch in the novel.
Yep. Oh, he's Hutch in the novel. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
And Joey is my friend Jerry.
Yep.
And Bones is Bones Saunders, Jack Saunders.
Yep.
And his little brother is Squirt.
Mm-hmm. And that was your in life. That was your main sort of crew of friends.
That was the gang. Yeah, that was the gang. And that was probably whom I played with almost all the time. Now, when we played softball in Withers Field, or we played hockey on the swamp, the kids from other neighborhoods would join us.
Yep.
And so there'd be there could be a very large gang on any given occasion.
There's a few instances in the novel where you're playing a game called Move Up, where there's at least 20 kids in the mix.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and then the other game is 500, where you knock out flies, and if you catch one, you get 500, or you get $100, and if you catch one on first bounce, you get 75 cents, and grounders are a quarter or something.
I'm not sure if they still play it. They did play it in the 90s.
They did, eh? Oh,
yeah, we played that. We played 500 for sure. The when you're talking about skating on the swamp, the thing that isn't probably obvious to the casual listeners, when Grandpa's talking about the swamp, he's talking about a swamp that's under the Blue Water Bridge. It's currently fenced off, but in your days there would be a rink under the bridge that you could play on.
Pretty close to it, that's right. And the swamp extended all the way over to what is now the casino in Venice Village on the far north.
Oh, yeah,
I would say of the territory that this village covered, at least a third of it, or 40% was swamp.
Yeah. To give the listener a sense of what the waterfront at Point Edward looks like, the skyline's absolutely dominated by the bridge. Point Edward it is the southernmost point of Sarnia against the river. I'm correct on that? Yeah. So basically, when you're in the waterfront of Point Edward, basically you see the bridge, you see the river, and you see a whole lot of boats. Do you remember the waterfront looking similar in your time, or has a lot changed down there?
The whole park project is new. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it was just open fields where we flew kites, and it's where the old railroad tracks used to be, the old switching tracks, and they took them out, and it was a nice. In fact, what surprised me on our trip back was how large that field was.
Yeah.
My memory was that it was smaller, but my memory failed me.
Yeah, it really is a massive field, and it's been beautifully developed down there. Clearly, that bridge revenue is going towards good things. Getting back to what we were talking about with that scene with Wiz and his sister, it's got to be one of the funniest scenes in the book. But this is a book that's got a lot of comedy in it. Do you find that? Did you detect that more on this read through? Because it's always been very funny from my perspective.
I was quite surprised, especially reading Winter's Descent, which I know is basically a dark growing up novel, but Lonnie, the character Lonnie, just made me laugh all the way through it.
Yeah.
And he was based on, he's called Lonnie Younger in the book, but he's based on Ronnie Young, who was in my one-room country school.
Right.
And he had, Mouth was his nickname.
Well, and it fits. So Lonnie's, he's a Winter's Descent character, right? He's not
Right.
not one of the townies.
No, the wisecracking character, to a much lesser extent, is Bones. And then I extended that characterization into Lonnie and really put it over the top.
Yeah. Some of the more because this book has a measured pace. Like it's I would say Summer's Idyll clips along a little more briskly than Winter's Descent.
Yes, it does, yeah.
Winter's Descent has a very measured pace, but you always seem to be able to throw in a little levity in between the parts that get a little grittier. The circus is, of course, the sort of the main arc of the first one. The second doesn't have that central narrative so much, but it's always bracketed by segments of the sort of the glories of childhood games.
Yes. Well, one reviewer said it has too many games.
Yes, that's what I was leading up to.
I was thinking as I was rereading it, there are sections I could cut.
Yeah, so Summer's Idyll is more lean for sure. Winter's Descent has more passages that are a little longer overall.
That's the way I developed the character, though. I mean, when you're trying to picture childhood, children don't have very limited conversational skills.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to reveal character, either you have to describe what they're thinking,
Mm-hmm.
or you put them. What I did was put them in a game setting.
Yep.
And had them yell back and forth at one another and show their spirit, their character, their complaints, and the little ad libs from Lonnie as it goes along. That's right. And so that as I was rereading it, I'm thinking, here is a character revelation scene. You learn more and more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And if you like the characters, then you probably like the book.
Yep. Well, and I think the characters are, the book's very strong on all fronts, but I think the characters are probably the most engaging part. There is a Dickensian cast of them. What I wanted to ask you was, I know you've been a proponent of memory exercises for a while.
Right.
How much of this did you recover through conscious recovery, and how much of it was just in your mind?
I wrote it the way I've written almost all of the novels, and that is, I've always done my research, as it were, as I go, even the historical novels. And basically what I did was I'd start to write a scene, and the memories would flood back from childhood, and then the scene would take shape. And that would be the sequence.
And so it would always be sort of, pardon me, it's almost like an on-the-fly kind of way of writing.
That's the way I do it, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I write in great bursts.
Mm-hmm.
And I sit down in my chair in the morning, and I start to write. If nothing comes, I go and do something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always written that way, and some of the novels, that novel was probably written in 2 months, 3 months maybe.
Yeah. One of the other things that is one of the other things I find apparent in these books on rereading, and I've now probably reread them twice since you and I started this project. There's a lot of levity, but there's also a lot of sort of the petty darkness of the small town creeps into a lot of these scenes.
Yes. That struck me too as I was rereading it this morning.
Mm-hmm.
The cruelty of small towns as a sub-theme.
Yeah. Oh, it's all through this novel, and there's a lot of these scenes that you in both novels, absolutely. A lot of these scenes that you play out are sort of macabre at times.
Yeah.
Especially some of the stuff involving animals can get gut-wrenching.
Well, there really was a stray dog that came to every day at lunchtime. That's when he would arrive, was just at lunchtime, and we would feed him. And I used him. So he's a real character.
Yeah, that's real.
But he didn't
right?
die that way.
No. Yeah, didn't get his head stove in by kids, thankfully.
But he did disappear one day, so he probably went off and died somewhere.
Yeah, his fate might have not been much different, really.
No.
The other thing I know there's a rather in Summer's Idyll, there's a couple of traumatic things that happen. The one is things keep setting on fire. I think there's at least 2 fires in this book. There's a barn fire, and is there maybe one more? Maybe it's just the barn fire.
No, the market, supermarket, the grocery store.
Because there were,
and that's true. And of course, you saw the empty space when we went up there where it was, and it was no more than 200 yards from our house.
Well, and in the true history of Point Edward, there are a lot of fires. There's the one that always strikes me. What was the name of the rink that was right where we had lunch? Did it have a name?
No.
Because when you were there, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was basically the remnants of a burned out rink, which was just the boards.
Yeah, just the board. That when I was a kid, we skated there, but there was there was a little cabin where we could change our clothes with a pot-bellied stove. But no, in fact, nobody ever told me that there had been a real arena there.
Really?
Yeah, I learned that story much later about the how it caught fire.
Yeah.
With the hot ingot being dropped from the bridge sometime in the summer of 1937 or 38.
During the sort of the end phases of construction of the bridge. Yeah, a hot rivet landed on it, and they said it burned down in 20 minutes. It leads me into something that happened in real life Point Edward that you and I have touched on briefly, but I've been reading a lot about the burning of the harmonic.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been in the 1940 or 41, or is it after that?
No, because after that, because I think 45. I was 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah.
And so, those two fires, the burning of the harmonic and the burning down of Burgess Market, were really seminal events in my own young life.
Yeah. The harmonic was a cruising liner that burned down at anchor in Point Edward, and you watched it. What was the name of the captain of the harmonic? Because he lived in your town, didn't he?
Garvey, I think.
That was Garvey. That was on the harmonic.
It was either Garvey or Beaton, one of those two. And one of them was in the storm of 13, and the other was on the harmonic, and I get the two of them mixed up.
Yep. But there was actually captains walking around Point Edward.
There were 7 of them when I was a kid, yeah.
and a couple of them at least make pseudonymous appearances in these books. When you had to people this world, are there any characters that on rereading you are very pleased with overall? Like, I think there's a lot to be proud of, but are there any real standouts for you on rereading?
Well, I like Wiz.
Yeah.
And I like Lonnie Younger very, very much. But also I like some of the girls. I tried to give girls character rather than just present them as young women.
Yep.
And give them a little spite and zip to them.
And that probably does service to them, given that you had such trouble writing in the first person.
Yeah.
Actually challenging yourself to represent them from a third person perspective is I think it does them service. I think that's a good thing. And
I had those were the only first-person novels that I've written.
Mm-hmm.
I was so used to the other way, but I just sat down. It was in my office that I started this book, and I wrote the first scene, and it came out in the first person.
Yeah.
And it just came out that way, and I thought, I'm just going to carry on. The writing I seem to have the right. What I'm looking for when I start is the right tone. Have I got the right voice? And that voice spoke to me instantly, and I thought, I've got so much in my childhood that I remember, not only in my poems, but I put into those 2 novels. All the movies I had seen, all the cartoons I had seen, and all the as you say, the games that we played endlessly, because that's basically all we had to do. We had no television, and radio was largely for grown-ups. There was very little for children on the radio, a little bit.
There's a few, you mentioned a few radio plays that you're listening to. And some of them Westerns, and then some of them in the mystery family as well. Yeah,
I love a mystery, The Shadow.
The Shadow Knows.
Yeah, and there were 3 or 4 of them. Those I heard, they came on early enough in the evening that I could stay up before I went to bed.
Right.
And I would hear them, my grandparents listening to them, or my mom turning the radio on in the kitchen during the war, and I would hear I Love a Mystery at 7 o'clock on certain nights, and then we would be sent to bed.
Now, the one thing I wanted to circle back around on that you mentioned briefly, when you first conceived this novel, you were calling it the day the stranger came.
The Day the Stranger Came.
When did you shift away from that? Because the stranger is a subplot in the novel. Did you initially envision that was going to be the central theme?
I did, and as I was rereading it this morning, I was further into it when the circus came in than I remembered. So I kind of slid in, and as soon as I got that, as soon as I got the circus idea, that I didn't have, there wasn't enough bulk in the Stranger theme. I mean, and I must have realized that about a quarter of the way through, and introduce the fact that it was summer, and that I had to fill in the games of summer, and of course I have no trouble doing that. That just came to me, and but some of the other scenes, like the trip to Saintsville and Bertram and all of that, they came later on as the book progressed. But they came as vignettes.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and
I love Bertram. I love Bertram.
Yeah. There are so many good characters. It's amazing.
He throws like a girl. And of course that upsets Will greatly.
Yes.
Will is trying to look for a father substitute, and Bertram is not it.
Yeah. No, he is not. No, he is not. The stranger subplot is notable in that I think one of the things it captures really well is how the town's imagination could be gripped.
Yeah, right.
Because basically, again, to sum up for the casual listener, the stranger is a presence that's lurking around the town, unseen, stealing
things. Yeah.
And then there's a subsequent disappearance. And they're conflated. They think that the stranger has kidnapped someone.
Yeah, Looney, a challenged boy, escapes and is lost for a while.
And he comes back fine. Spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But the stranger turns out to be a figure of pity.
Yeah.
By the end, so there is some meat on that subplot, but I think it does well to just sort of highlight the small town feel that you're developing in the book.
Yeah, and the whispers back and forth, and Graham and Gramps' comments on it all. He's a figure that I like as well. But I wish I could say he was like my grandfather, but my grandfather was not like that. He was just a very quiet man. But in both the novels, there are really one or two chippy characters. M is like that in the second novel, and always has a comment or a quip.
Yep.
And I must admit that all of that surprised me, because when I go out casually with my friends, as I have for many years, I'm not considered a witty person. It's all in my head. I never get it out when I'm sitting around having a conversation with my friends.
Yeah, I think with your family too, you mostly observe while we take the lead. But there is so much wit, but it definitely comes through these other voices.
Right.
And it's rarely the protagonist that's...
No, he's sort of a better version of myself. I was not as nice a person as Will.
Yeah, he's very pure of heart in that book, in these novels. It brings me yes?
I was just going to say, and the other thing he's interested in is writing, and that's another sub-theme that runs through both books, is how he became a writer. And so he's an observer in many ways as well. He's listening to all this stuff, even when he isn't the main person in a scene. He's there.
Yeah, well, and he is the observer of a lot of back and forth between the kids, and it fleshes out not just the characters but the time. You sort of see the attitudes towards war and small town life developing in these kids. Now, you characterize Summer's Idyll and Winter's Descent as fundamentally anti-war novels. Was that how you were feeling at the time? Do you feel like it dovetails with your experience?
Well, no. The novel I had written previous to this in the before 2000, in the early 90s or the late 80s, this novel came out.
Yep.
How the World Began, a fable of 1812.
Right.
And it's a dark anti-war novel.
I don't know if I've ever read that one. It'll have to go on my list.
You'll find it absolutely completely different from what we're talking about, or even the mystery novels have some wit in them.
Was that a conscious tonal shift?
Well, of course, by the late 80s, the poetry had started to dry up, so I was looking around for themes, and I've always wanted to write about the War of 1812.
Yeah.
That's another historical period I'm interested in, and I had just finished reading Pierre Berton's 2-volume history of the War of 1812.
Right.
So I thought I would like to try a war novel of some kind. And I don't think it's a highly successful novel. I don't think you'll be blown away by it. The main character is a young man who's slightly retarded, and so you get a skewed view of the world.
Right.
And the couple of reviews that we've got it, that we got of the book, both had trouble with the narrator. Just was he challenged, or if he was, how did he see these things? So I don't think it was the success I had hoped for. But it has some wonderful gritty war scenes in it. It describes the massacre that Tecumseh's comrades committed down in south of Lake Erie when they went down to meet the Kentuckians.
Right.
And they defeated the Kentucky force, and the wounded were put in a barn. And Tecumseh tried to stop his men from going in there, but they went in and killed every wounded. So it's a really grim little novel. There's no humor in it whatsoever.
Yeah, well, that's sort of the grimness that preceded it in some of the mythic period.
So in some ways, it's a complete anomaly, because even when you and I were looking at the
A True History of
Lambton County and God's Geography, there's humor and yeah.
Well, and I think that sort of it came to be a defining feature of some of your works in this time was trying to be a little bit more humorous, and I feel like the Point Edward setting just lends itself to such levity. Okay. Now another thing I wanted to touch on was Grandpa and I got a chance briefly to check out Canatera Park, which if you're ever in the area it's stunning. But some of the more some of the more colorful descriptions in the novel are about your play in the park. It seems like Canatera was a huge part of the scenery of Point Edward and the scenery of your young life.
Yeah. And in those days, again, if you were to visit the park during the week, before the weekend picnickers and everybody are there with their cars and their children, it was mainly us, just kids our age, running around in that huge, wonderful space, inventing imaginative games to play, cowboys and Indians and all of that sort of thing, and then going down for a swim, and then coming back up and playing in the park again to get cooled off. And all that, of course, when we were up there last, it was wall-to-wall cars.
Yeah.
I mean, all the little winding lanes are all parked with cars, and they're full of families now, which is great.
But it's just different.
But it's quite different. The we were tremendously advantaged as children, because the village was ours to wander around in. We had one policeman. There was never any kind of violence until after I left. There was a murder.
Yes.
And that was the only one we ever had. And people never locked their doors. And we went in and out of each other's houses quite freely. It was wonderful.
one of the things that I think is really great about this book is it's high. I wouldn't call it highly quotable. There are several very, very entertaining short sections that you have told me, and I can imagine, made very successful public readings.
Yeah.
Did you do many of those in the early years? Like many public readings of this work?
No.
No?
I didn't. No. I read, when I did public readings, I did quite a bit in the 80s and a few in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
It was always poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I only got to read that Bertram section at a gathering of friends. And there were
okay.
maybe 15 people at a house out in the suburbs at John Ogletree's house, and we were out there.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to have a literary evening.
Right.
So he invited a young woman who wrote poetry, and she read from her poems. And then my turn came, and I read that little vignette that worked exceedingly well as a short story.
Yeah, I almost feel like if it were... So basically, what Grandpa and I are talking about, there's a scene later in the book where Will and his mother and Uncle Bertram, who is sort of... It's implied that he's a romantic interest of the mother.
Yeah.
On some level. They leave... They go to the hotel, which is... All the bars were called hotels at that point.
Yeah, that's right.
They go to the hotel beer garden and leave Will in the truck with comic books. And I think the denouement of the scene is him having to pee into a Pepsi bottle or something like that because he's stranded.
No, he pees all over Bertram's brand new toolbox.
Oh, that's what it is.
He gets his revenge at the end, and that when I read it at the little gathering, I got huge guffaws.
Yeah.
In fact, they could see me leading up to it. I said, suddenly another thought occurred in his head, and they started to laugh. They knew what was coming. But the toolbox was the coup de grace.
Yes.
Because he gets his vengeance back on Cousin Bertram.
Yes. It's that scene is so compact and beautifully written. If it were written a little differently, it would make a wonderful monologue. It sort of makes me sad that more people didn't get to hear a public reading of that. But that's one of the strengths of this vignette form, is that these little bits can land with such gravity when you're intensely focused in these small scenes.
Mm-hmm.
On reading back through, were there any scenes that stuck out to you in a way that you hadn't maybe thought of before?
Well, there were little things like Wiz's sister coming out with her little dog. I had forgotten entirely. There's so many little things like that struck me as I was rereading it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in rereading Winter's Descent, I love the way it ends. I thought the writing of the last 15 or 20 pages is some of the best writing I've ever done. In fact, a very good friend of mine telephoned me to talk about Winter's Descent, which I had sent him when it first came out, and he said, "I'm sitting in a restaurant, Don, and tears are running down my face." And I thought, what a good review.
Yeah, you can't get much better than that. Art is supposed to make you feel something. And
yeah,
the last closing scenes of Winter's Descent are sort of it's basically a juxtaposition between Will and a young woman skating, and then he sort of thinks his way through the events of the second novel, and even some of the first he's touching on at that point in time. I guess this is as good a time as any to ask you, were you consciously trying to evoke some of that darker material in Winter's Descent, or is that just the natural progression?
Well, the progression was, in the first novel, it's pre-sexual.
Mm-hmm.
The girls are playmates, they're characters, and they have no gender, basically. I mean, they're girls and they're treated as girls, but that's a phrase that younger boys use, which is a pejorative.
Yes.
Those are just girls.
Yeah, you throw like one or you run like one.
So there's a lot of that in the book. But the second one was deliberately coming of age.
Mm-hmm.
And and so I guess I found my own adolescence not entirely sunny.
Mm-hmm.
And we lived out on that farm,
Mm-hmm.
in that farming area, and it was a very lonely life, really.
Yeah.
My mother and dad were in the process of breaking up,
Mm-hmm.
but they did get together again, and when my dad moved to Chatham, he kind of started over again as a father, and then they finally split up and he left.
Mm-hmm.
And so the emptiness of the house when he comes home from school,
Mm-hmm.
and that was all very close to me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's he's sort of functioning as a latchkey kid in those days.
Yeah. My mother suffered from migraine, so I would come home from school. My dad would be doing a double shift,
Mm-hmm.
and my mother would be in bed with her migraine, poor soul.
It's a family affliction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the tone of Winter's Descent is, I mean, and even just in the title, it's
Yeah.
you can tell, but it's it's certainly a darker tone, and in a way a little more introspective at times. You spend a
Yeah.
lot of time in the narrator's head as he comes to terms with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. That's true. That's quite a difference between the two novels. Yeah, and the second one, as you alluded to earlier, is not as tight as the first one.
Mm-hmm.
There are scenes that a good editor probably would have me cut, but I didn't have a good editor.
That brings me around to another thing I wanted to touch on. I guess we can start with how was the critical reception to these books when they came out?
There were only 2 reviews of each of them, and that's the weakness of having a small publisher.
Mm-hmm.
When they came out in the early to mid 90s, it was just the era when there was very little reviewing being done. The newspapers had started to cut back. There used to be a huge section in the Globe and Mail, 5, 6, 7 page section on books.
Yeah.
And all my early books were reviewed in the Globe and Mail.
Mm-hmm.
These were not.
Yeah.
And so they probably sold a few hundred copies.
Yeah.
And so I think I did mention to you that I have sent Summer's Idyll to Beverly Slocum
Right.
and asked her if she would reread it
Mm-hmm.
and send it out to see if we could republish it, reissue it. And she's agreed to do that. She hasn't got around to it yet, but she will eventually. And because I think there's a shot that some mainstream publisher might pick it up because it's short. It isn't going to cost them
Mm-hmm.
a lot of money like Lily's story is.
Well, and I have high hopes if you ever get an ebook copy, because paper copies are great, but there's a lot of market for ebooks these days, and it would be really nice if we could get this book into people's hands.
Well, you've just given me an idea. I've just done 2 things.
Mm-hmm.
I published a couple of my poetry books have been self-published,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore only given around to my friends and supporters,
Mm-hmm.
and to the local libraries and so on, so they would have it in their collections, and to the National Library. But I just recently had both of them made into ebooks for $250
Yeah.
and put up on Amazon and Chapters,
Oh.
so that if someone is looking at my work
Mm-hmm.
somewhere down the line and they're looking for this stuff online, they'll be there as ebooks. They won't sell any copies, but I wanted them to be there for the next generation. So I think I'll try and do that with these books.
Yeah.
I've got them on the computer,
Mm-hmm.
and that's all the printer needs is a computer digital copy,
Mm-hmm.
and then they format it. That's what you pay for. They have to format it,
Mm-hmm.
and then they upload it for you.
And then this is sort of a print to order deal, right? So if anyone buys it, they'll print them a copy and mail it to them.
Well, no, these are just ebooks.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
just ebooks.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
That-
I'm trying to get get it reissued.
Right.
With Beverly, but I thought, well, even with the poetry books, researchers may use the internet 20 years from now when somebody wants to write a book about my poetry.
I can almost guarantee it.
I wanted all my poems to be at least e-books. And certainly it would be nice if we could have this reissued and sold as a softcover book. I would be delighted.
Yeah. Of your, you've written a couple, you've written over 100 books of various varieties, I think, right?
I've written 53 books so far.
53 books.
And I have several more due out.
Of all your works, where does this rank in your own opinion? Where do you find it lies?
I find Summer's Idyll just behind Lily's Story.
Yeah.
They're quite different, so you really can't compare them. But in terms of my best writing in prose, Summer's Idyll and Lily's Story would be it.
Yeah. And it's it must be nice to have a chance to read back through it.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there any aspects of this book that you think I'm missing, or that you think are particularly worth noting that we haven't touched on?
No, we've touched on the war theme, which is what I wondered if people would get the violence between the two groups of kids who fight it out. And I just reread that scene where Will tries to play the peacemaker and he gets punched flat in the nose.
Yeah, tries to do a good thing and gets punched in the nose.
Those were probably a not too subtle attempt to make allusions to the war going on in Europe, and here we are with these two groups of violent kids fighting it out.
Yep.
And Miss Nielsen reading them the riot act and trying to preach to them and to tell them to be good citizens and so on. And of course, Miss Nielsen is based on Miss Nelson, my teacher for 2 years at SS number 12.
And this is the last thing I wanted to touch on. The theme that sort of begins to build through the novels and sort of climaxes at the end is the development of our narrator becoming or of budding as a writer and becoming a writer in his own right. This was around the time when you discovered writing, contemporaneous with the age of our narrator.
Yes, in grade 7, I wrote the Christmas play for our little school. And I even acted in it.
Yeah.
And it was put on in the township hall.
Really?
And, yeah, there was quite an audience there. And no, I was absolutely delighted. No, Miss Nelson was wonderful. She realized that I didn't need an awful lot of teaching. She had 23 other kids to look after in that school. So she turned the little library loose on me, and I would sit at the back and either read or draw.
Yeah.
And she was quite happy to have me do that on my own. Yeah. Now, I took part in the arithmetic lessons and the geography lessons and so on.
Yeah.
But when it came to English lessons, I just went off and read.
Right.
And I also, that same year in grade 7, wrote a long ballad on Wolfe and Montcalm.
Okay.
Yeah, which my mother threw out, so I don't have it anymore.
This is the theme we keep running up to. I was going to ask whether there's any chance any of this survived. Great-grandma threw it out.
Yeah, when we moved from Sarnia to Chatham, my mother made me give away all my records to my friends and clean out my drawer, which is where I kept these little scraps of paper with the poems on.
We run into this every episode where Grandpa mentions something he wrote when he was younger, and I'm desperate to read it, and it's always it got lost in the purge.
I've got some of the stuff I wrote, but probably in you'd have to go back to my first year in university.
Yeah.
In fact, a friend of mine just showed me an old folio, which was the University Literary Magazine, which I helped edit
Yeah.
in 1958, and I had 3 poems in it, and they were awful. Oh, they were just terrible.
Yeah.
And you know the story of Al Purdy going through libraries and removing and burning copies of his first production.
Mm-hmm.
Because they were all in rhyming couplets.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a little how I feel reading anything I wrote in my younger days, and some things I write still. So you're not unique in that. That's funny. Well, I guess we'll end with the question I always ask you, and that's, how does it feel to read back through these?
I did that this morning, and I thought, this is good writing. I mean, I hated saying so to myself, but I thought, this, after all these years, I can still read this, and I still think that it's good prose.
Yeah. Well, I think Summer's Idyll is my favorite of your works. Having now considered a large number of your works, I still think Summer's Idyll comes out on top, and Winter's Descent is a book that demands a lot of the reader, but it is worth the time you have to put into it. Well, that's great, Grandpa. As always, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. The one thing I wanted to touch on before we go, and we'll have told our dear listeners about this many times, but Grandpa just has a book of poetry out recently, which is just self-published, and that's called The Sands of Canatera.
Mm-hmm.
His recent publications include The Blue Flow Below, Inundations, and Tidings, all from Black Moss Press.
One from Hidden Brook Press,
Right.
Inundations.
Yeah.
The rest from Black Moss.
And then you have 2 upcoming books of poetry
With Black Moss.
with Black Moss in the next 2 years, and a third in the works, I'm hearing.
A third in the works, yeah.
Well, that's great. I look forward to reading them. Well, as always, thank you so much, Grandpa.
Oh, you're welcome, Tom.
Got to go, but you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by a little longer.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that conversation. I certainly enjoyed having it. Grandpa and I's trip to Point Edward was a really important one for both of us, and it was really nice to finally put a place to all the stories. It really is a tiny spot. Like, you can, at a brisk pace, you can walk across it in 5 minutes, and it looms so large in Grandpa's memory that it was a really good experience to go down there and tour around with him. The interesting thing is, a lot of the houses are the same. Like, they've not been replaced. And as it turns out, it's because you're not actually allowed, or at least building new in that area is really restricted. So it was kind of cool. Grandpa could describe a lot of the houses we were going to see, and sure enough, there they'd be. It was a really good time. I really encourage you to go out and get a copy of Summer's Idyll on ebook for yourself. You'll enjoy it. It's a good read. Hopefully, hearing us talk about it has piqued your curiosity. This is a project that's more about Grandpa and I spending some time enjoying his work than seeking widespread commercial appeal. But if you've enjoyed what you've heard, feel free to tell a friend. You can find us on iTunes, and if you can rate, review, and subscribe, that always helps us get our stuff out there. You can also find the podcasts at our website, gutteridgeshows.ca. Grandpa has a couple new books just come out and on the way out. So his book of poetry, The Blue Flow Below, came out this year from Black Moss Press. He has a couple other recent books of poetry also available from Black Moss Press, and there's another couple coming out in the next couple of years. So keep your eye out. Our next episodes are going to be dealing with some of his poetry, which again is great. I think you'll really enjoy it. Special thank you to Joe Organ and the band Moves for the use of their song A Little Longer for our intro and outro music. That is from the album Tape, and you can find Moves on Bandcamp and Joe Organ on SoundCloud. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you for joining us on There and Then.
But you stop me saying no, no, no. I guess I'll stay on by.